Welcome everyone to the second episode of the EFF-CoP Authentic Appetites podcast. This one titled Food Beyond the Label. My name is Joris Boom. I am a research fellow at the University College Dublin, working on the EFF-CoP project. And with me here I have two guests, Chris Ellott and Quincy Lissaur. Welcome.
Hi, Joris.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
So we'll start with a little introduction of both of you guys. So Chris, maybe you can start.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's great that you're doing these podcasts. We want to, I guess, disseminate as much information about EFF-CoP and the difficult subject of food fraud as possible. So my name is Chris Ellott. I'm honorary professor at Queen's University, Belfast, professor of food security at Thammasat University in Thailand, and I do a lot of scientific advice for, it could be food companies, technology companies, and do quite a lot with different UN agencies all around either food safety or food fraud, or often actually food safety and fraud, because one impacts the other.
Yeah, of course, very much does. Thank you. Okay. And Quincy, can you tell a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Joris. My name is Quincy Lissaur. I am the Executive Director of SSAFE. SSAFE is a global public-private partnership set up as a non-profit organization incorporated in the US. But we are a global organization that works on emerging issues that affect the safe supply and trade of food around the world. We're a membership organization. We have 12 members, and our 12 members represent the entire food supply chain from farm to fork, with members such as Cargill and OSI at the front end of the supply chain, Compass Group and McDonald's at the other end of the supply chain, leading ingredient producers like Kerry Group and Givaudan, as well as major manufacturers such as Mars, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Danone, Nestle, and several others. We have been around since 2003, and we then work on these emerging issues. And therefore, when in 2015, the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, came out with a requirement that companies needed to do a food fraud vulnerability assessment and start preparing mitigation plans, we really stepped into the fray to help the industry, particularly small and medium-sized businesses around the world, put together a tool to help them identify their particular vulnerabilities and start preparing mitigation plans. And that really followed on some of the work that Chris did a little bit earlier in the decade on horse meat and the scandal that erupted in the UK around the horse meat scandal, as it was known. So we've been working with Chris for the better part of about 10 years on this particular topic. It is one that hasn't gone away. It would have been nice if it had, but it's not one that is ever going to go away, I don't think. It is one, though, that we as an industry, both the public and private sector, can continue to work on together to try to reduce it to the largest extent possible. I'll leave it at that for now, and we can dig a little bit deeper into that in a minute.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. So we're going to talk about the topic of food fraud again. And to get the conversation started, we're going to first start by defining the threat and seeing how the current global conditions steer the food fraud threat currently. So, very basic question first. I'll ask Chris, just what is your definition of food fraud, and what are the implications for a consumer?
So thanks, Joris. Do you know, it would seem to be a very simple question, please define food fraud, but so many organizations have tried to come up with definitions for a very long period of time. It's very difficult to get total agreement. And actually, until you get total agreement, until you get a standard definition of something, then it becomes more difficult actually to take legal action, for instance. So, and we're still going through that at the moment. Believe it or not, my definition of food fraud I wrote in 2014 when I wrote the UK government report on basically on trying to prevent fraud in the UK food system. And because I'm quite a simple person, I kept it as quite a simple definition. It's those people who set out to cheat or deceive food businesses and or consumers, and they want to do it to gain money. It's for financial gain. So it's a simple definition, but what sits behind that is there is a multitude of different ways people have and currently do try to cheat businesses and consumers as well. It manifests itself in so many different ways. And sometimes, Joris, you can have a problem of what happened accidentally and what was done deliberately. And in the world of crime and law, I talk with many people, very senior people in the police, and it is really difficult to prove intent. Yeah. The intent to perpetrate criminal activity. So sitting behind all of that is you can find food that is substandard, that doesn't meet quality criteria. It isn't what it says on the label. To actually prove somebody or some organization did that deliberately, it's a really, really big challenge. And I think Quincy will know a lot about that, dealing with food companies, because, often, food companies, a lot of those businesses that Quincy talked about, when they procure different ingredients, different commodities, they'll have very, very tight specifications in their contract for around procurement. And sometimes if those specifications aren't met, businesses will say, oh, sorry, it was an accident, or you haven't measured things properly. And that actually proving intent continues to be a major challenge now. So, sorry, I started off with a very simple definition, and then I started to tell you all of the problems about having a very simple definition. Quincy, what do you think?
We're entirely aligned there, right, Chris? I mean, from our perspective, we've split it between two parts, right? On the one hand, you've got unintentional or accidental adulteration, which could lead to a foodborne illness, right? That we really talk to address that. We really work on both quality and safety, so food quality and food safety. On the other end, you've got intentional adulteration. And even within that, we've separated it into two parts. One is fraud, the other one is defense. Defense, and we're not going to focus that on this today, but just to describe that, that's really ideologically driven. That is somebody who wants to harm the population, large, small, but they want to create harm for ideologically or politically motivated reasons. The fraud side of things, as Chris already said, is economically motivated. They're trying to gain money. And therefore, the big difference as well between defense and fraud is, in defense, you want to have very big impact, as large as possible, as quickly as possible, because you want to reach the news and you want to scare people. On economically motivated adulteration, there we're really talking about trying to hide it as long as possible, right? Because the longer that you hide it, the more money you're going to make. So if you can only hide it for 6 months and you do 5 shipments, you're only going to gain so much. If you can run this for 5 or 10 years and you do 100 or 1,000 shipments, now all of a sudden you're talking about serious money, and we're talking into the millions or even billions potentially. Basically, a rough estimate done by PwC about 7 or 8 years ago when we were working with them was that food fraud can probably generate approximately $25 to $30 billion worth of losses across the food industry. That's billions with a B, not M or millions. It is a very, very large number. That in return then has a number of potential consequences. One of the things Chris mentioned earlier is food safety. It can create a food safety issue, but not necessarily, right? The quicker that people get ill, the more likely it is that it's going to get found out quicker. So really, when you look at the different types of food fraud, whether that is from substitution, concealment, mislabeling, dilution, gray market production and theft, counterfeiting or unapproved enhancements, some of them are going to be able to last much longer and you're going to be able to make more money. And that is really what, as a fraudster, they're going to try to do, hide it as best as possible from their particular customers, whether that is a consumer or somewhere in the middle of the supply chain, in order to make as much money as they possibly can.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
On top of that, Joris, it's a global problem, right? It's not a problem for one country or another. And the longer that our supply chains are, the more difficult it becomes to identify it, address it, fix it, and move beyond it, right? So I know Chris has done quite a lot of work in that supply chain side because, Chris, when you did the horse meat investigation, right? Part of the reason why that was actually able to flourish in the first place was because of the complex supply chain and that meat coming out of one part of the world into the UK, right? Or have I got that wrong?
I think that's a very, very good example, Quincy. When I started to look at the horse meat scandal, it started off as a problem between Ireland and the UK. And it was about actually not meeting contract specifications. One company that was supplying the supposed beef at that time decided that they couldn't supply enough Irish or UK beef, so they subcontracted that to another meat company, who in turn subcontracted it to another company. And guess what? They then subcontracted that to a meat broker, like a dealer. There was no control at all in that supply chain, none whatever. And very, very few people actually in that supply chain ever had physical contact with the meat itself. Everything was being done either by computers or actually over mobile phones. So commodities being bought and sold, traded, and it was totally out of control. And when you've got an out of control supply chain, those people who cheat, who commit fraud, will step in and rub their hands together because it's like Quincy said, they can make money out of it. Probably nobody will know about the cheating that's going on at the moment, as long as you don't poison anybody. And the horse meat scandal was a great example. It was actually just a random test. One random test, suddenly red lights started to flash all over the place. Now, in terms of these supply chains that Quincy and myself are talking about, and when we talk about the length, it's not about the kilometers or miles that food travels. It's about the number of different companies and organizations that are part of that supply chain. Some like to do things wonderfully well. And I think, a lot of those companies that Quincy talked about, their reputation absolutely relies on doing things absolutely right and correct. But whenever you start to subcontract out to smaller companies, that's when you run into trouble. Because in some cases, in some of those smaller companies, there are that criminal element, those people who will set out to cheat and deceive. And actually, with the coordinator of EFF-CoP, one of our joint PhD students, she did an amazing piece of work and actually tracked a lot of fraud down. And this was in the fish supply chain. Quite often it was family-run businesses. And it was family-run businesses because the senior management were all related to each other. So they could trust each other. Because it takes not one person in the company, it takes quite a few people to actually deliver fraudulent practices. Yeah. So often when we talk about vulnerabilities, I ask people, do you know your supply chains? Always the answer is yes. After I ask them 3 questions, then the answer is actually, no, I don't. Because have you got real control in supply chains? And the answer is no. And I think that's where some of the large businesses, the large corporates, have really stepped up their game in controlling supply chains. Right. There is, in the UK, post the horse meat, there were so many businesses actually lost contracts not because they were cheating, but because there was a centralization of only buying from those people who knew their supply chains, controlled their supply chains, and kept it in what we would call vertically integrated way. A goes to B, B goes to C. You don't have a myriad of subcontracts sitting in there.
Yeah, Joris, let me add something to that if you don't mind. So, as Chris said, companies do try very hard to best understand their supply chains, but it is very difficult. We did another project about a year ago, not related to fraud, but looking at how farmers can reduce contamination, cross-contamination on farm. And one of our members buys chilies from a particular country in Asia. There are 5 million chili farmers in this country. So by the time it comes to my member, it will have gone through 4 or 5 other stages across the supply chain. They will not know the farmer, they will not know the collection center that the farmer sends it to, or the primary production facility where they will collect from the collection centers. So that is already 3 steps. Then it gets bought by some very large aggregators who will then put it into containers and on ships before it gets to Europe. That is how deep and how long that supply chain is. They cannot go to the individual 5 million farmers, right? They try to do their best, and we try to push our tools, our education, all of our activities that we do to try to help strengthen food safety generally and food fraud mitigation techniques specifically into that supply chain. As you can imagine, with 5 million farmers, that is extremely difficult, right? So you do also therefore need to find the right link at the right part of the supply chain to figure out how it is that you can mitigate against fraud. Related to that then is testing. So one of the things that a lot of organizations goes, well, I'm going to test. I'm like, yeah, great. Test away. What are you looking for? Oh, I don't know. Go back to melamine, right? Who on earth would have ever tested for melamine? Nobody, because nobody would be crazy enough to put melamine in baby powder formula, right? Who would do that? Nobody. So nobody was testing for it. So not until babies started getting sick and ill, and unfortunately we had some deaths there as well, really, really sad. Until that happened, nobody was actually testing for melamine, right? Because you don't know what you're looking for. So what we then say, and this I'm trying to now steer this a little bit more positively, right? What can we actually do about it? What we really say is there's 5 core elements. And the stages that you need to go through is, first, you need to collect information and data, right? Within your own organization, around your supply chain, the kinds of fraud that occur, et cetera, et cetera. You then need to do a vulnerability assessment, identify where it is that you as an organization are vulnerable. Once you've got those identified, you then develop implementation mitigation techniques, right? So you implement your mitigation techniques based on the vulnerabilities that you've identified, while at the same time also doing spot product testing. Product testing is really expensive, so you can't test all your products all the time, but you do want to test along and over time. You don't just want to test, oh, I've got a new supplier coming on board, I'm going to test their product as they send me a sample and then never test again. No, you do want to do some spot checks from time to time as well. And while you're doing all that, you also want to educate and train your staff. Those are probably the 5 key things that I would say you need to do on top of understanding your supply chain and doing traceability across your supply chain as well. Now, Chris, you're an academic expert on this. Would you kind of agree that those are kind of like the key stages of what you need to do as an organization?
So, I mean, I think, the simple answer is yes. You need to know your supply chain. You need to really understand. So, for instance, I mean, one of those examples that Quincy talked about is understand a very simple thing called mass balance. So what is mass balance? It is you have X amount of tons of material as a business that you're going to sell. How much do you sell? That's Y. X should equal Y. Believe it or not, the first sign of fraud, X does not equal Y. Y is bigger than X. Okay, flashing light. And that's not difficult information to get hold of. And so there are lots of ways that you can I identify companies that are not doing things properly. Quincy also talked about the testing. Well, I'm an analytical chemist, so I will always say testing is a really important part of it. But there are so many different types of fraud. What test do you use? And melamine's a great example because nobody would be silly enough to use melamine now, but could well think about another source of nitrogen to add in, and then you have to look for a completely different test. So where I think we have got a lot smarter, particularly over the last 3 to 5 years, we don't look for melamine, we don't look for Sudan dyes, we look for the fingerprints of food now. Those chilies, for instance, what does a chili fingerprint look like? A chemical fingerprint. I can use a very small device attached to my smartphone. It can take the fingerprint of those chilies in 5 seconds. And if the fingerprint is normal, this is a really good sign that there has been no adulteration, nobody has added dyes to it and so forth. But if I get an abnormal fingerprint, then I've got to take a decision as a business. Do I stop those going into a supply chain? That's a big decision, actually. This is because the supply chains move quickly. Nothing moves faster in the world than the food supply chains. So to hold back a consignment, you've got to have some good evidence. So a lot of what we're doing now for this fingerprinting is we can take that scan within a few seconds. That fingerprint can get uploaded into a digital traceability system. And actually, we can follow that right across supply chains. So it might be the material doesn't stop at that part of the supply chain, but that will be tracked whenever you get that more expensive laboratory test done. And it actually shows you do have a problem. You've now identified where that sits in the supply chain and you can do something about it. So a lot of the projects I'm involved in is about taking these really fast fingerprints of food commodities. If you get, and we call it atypical result, then you've got a menu of options to do. You can say, well, I just ignore it, take the risk. Not something that I would advise, to be honest with you. Then there is, let's keep it going in the supply chain, but when it reaches its next port of destination, hopefully we'll have a laboratory test back and we'll take some action there. But the fingerprinting is actually getting so good now. And the fingerprinting is getting much better, not so much because of the measurement technology, but because we can now apply a lot of different AI tools, particularly machine learning, to it. They're getting more and more accurate and more reliable. And what we're seeing is those people who really want to control their supply chains, they're doing all of those things that Quincy talked about, but they're also now employing this. Let's take a quick scan, a quick digital scan of this. Let's follow it across the supply chains.
Right. And then you talk about these very in-depth analytical techniques and the analysis with chemometrics using AI is getting much better. Still, for a small, let's see, an SME, those kind of methods would be quite expensive, wouldn't it?
Well, I think a lot of the testing that Quincy talked about, they are so expensive, they take so long. Most small businesses really cannot entertain having like a quality control program. It's too difficult. Which test do they get done? Which laboratory do they choose to do the work? It really doesn't work well. But again, I go back to this fingerprinting, the chemometrics and AI. You can have a scanner the size of a mobile phone in which you can take a scan. Actually, we have started working with some SMEs in the same sector that Quincy was talking about in herbs and spices, where if you're not really careful, you can buy a consignment of adulterated material. One business we're working with at the moment did that, didn't have the right QC in place. Now they're facing some serious litigation. They have to deal with that as a business, but now they are starting to use this. Let's scan our product. And it actually not only deals with issues about authenticity, you can get very nice quality measurements at the same time because it's all the same data. So I'm interested because, I mean, I think, Quincy, you talked about, testing is not the solution. You can do some random testing, but what about this idea of taking these kind of really fast digital signatures, uploading them onto a blockchain or a digital twin?
Absolutely, Chris. So what I said is it's not the only solution, right? It is part of the broader solution. That's kind of the message I was trying to give. I'm not saying don't test at all, right? But obviously the problem is you can only test for those things that you know that you're looking for. And when you don't know what you're looking for, you can test all you want, but you're not going to find it, right? That was kind of the message I was trying to say. Now, I agree with you. I think that as new technologies are coming on board, it's reducing the actual cost. It is actually allowing us to do it more quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So I would agree with you on that one completely, Chris. The other thing I was also going to say about this is SMEs, they are not going to do the testing. They don't even do most of the testing today. So what ends up happening is the testing either happens at the factory entrance as part of a quality control program of a large manufacturer, right? So all of my members, they will do testing, right? Particularly on the manufacturing side, or the retailer will do testing, right? Now that's expensive. They can't afford it. They do put that into part of their quality control program. But again, they're only going to find what they are actually looking for. Therefore, one of the other elements that we have focused on a lot is, and again, shifting over to another topic, food safety culture, right? With one of the professors that we worked with, Joris, what you mentioned earlier, Saskia helped us develop our food fraud vulnerability assessment tool, but there was also Wim Huisman from the VU in the Netherlands who helped us, and he's a criminologist. And anecdotally, he said, what we are finding, and not only in the food industry, in certain other sectors as well, is that close to 70% of fraud actually occurs within the direct sphere of influence of a company, i.e. within its own four walls. That means that people within its own company are actually committing most of the fraudulent activity that actually occurs. Well, what does that mean then? Well, then I would say, well, you really need to have a very strong organizational cultural program in place. And that then links quite nicely into, okay, if we have a strong organizational culture that is focused on doing the right thing all the time, even when nobody is looking, now you're really starting to create a culture whereby the likelihood of fraud actually occurring when, if the numbers are right, close to 70% of fraud happens within your own organization, that number can significantly reduce, right? So there is an integration around that as well, not only around testing, but also around culture, also around identifying your vulnerabilities, mitigate against those, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of broadens out the topic here of the kind of things that you can do. All that said, coming back to your question though, Chris, yeah, absolutely. A lot of these new technologies that are coming through, the fingerprinting, uploading it, blockchain, absolutely valuable, right? And using AI to analyze these very large quantities of data is going to be very beneficial as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that indeed with just technological solutions, there's this kind of, I would say, arms race where if you invent a new way of testing, you test for melanin, there won't be melanin in products anymore. But since it's a economic, there is some economic gain, some financial gain there might be another way to go around it. So by developing new technological advancements, you always have to test for new stuff. So I would agree there that there's more necessary in terms of sociological approach. Chris, what's your view on this? How do you add to just technological solutions? How do you properly integrate that, you think?
So I think, Joris, testing is not the solution. It is one. It's one of the solutions that is part of a large mitigation program. It will never replace auditing, inspections, all of those things that Quincy talked about. I still think is the big innovation is it's fingerprints now. It's not looking for particular contaminants or adulterants. It's these fingerprints that we're looking for. And also, I guess when we're talking about, AI, I think 50% of the time when I talk about AI, it's about negative things. 50% of the time, it's about positive things.
Right.
I was actually taking a master class for the UK food industry yesterday in London, and I talked about AI, and I told them some of the terrible things, the ability to produce false certification, false certificates. Amazing now. I've seen some examples where I know laboratory testing certificates pretty well. They fool me. They're so good. So there is a kind of a downside to AI, but I also talked about some of the positives. So for instance, one of the things that we have developed, we call it the risk dashboard. And the risk dashboard is about what actually should we be worried about at this particular moment in time. Now, if you take some of the large retailers, some of the people that Quincy works with, some that I work with, on any day of the week, they will sell between 30,000 and 50,000 different food products. And each of those food products is made up of a range of different ingredients. Now, if you've got 50,000 products on sale and you ask the technical director, which one are you most worried about at the moment? That's a tough question, really tough. So what we are trying to do now is think about, again, using AI, and this time we call it predictive analytics. This is trawling very, very large data sets. Some of them are open source, some we can all get access to. Some are closed source, like laboratory testing results. Then we can start to produce these nice machine learning algorithms where it will give you not only the particular ingredients or commodities that you should be worried about at any given time, it will also tell you about the geographic regions where you should also be worried about. So suddenly, instead of having 50,000 problems to worry about, you can really start to reduce that down to a relatively small number. The next thing is very important, and this really, I think, comes back to what Quincy was talking about food safety. I always say to people is you have to prioritize anything that could have a food safety consequence. Now,
Absolutely.
I had a discussion with a company a few years ago, and they were worried about, on their product, it said one of the ingredients was an oranges from Seville. Wonderful oranges. And this guy in the technical team was really getting very concerned about whether these oranges came from Seville or not. And I said, I'm not so worried. I'd be more worried if there was some mercury in your oranges, because depending where you source from in the world, you can have problems with heavy metal contamination. Now, I certainly did not reassure that guy at all. In fact, I think I gave him more sleepless nights. But it's this kind of prioritization. So we have developed, we call it our risk dashboard now, where companies can upload their 5,000, 10,000 different ingredients. And it will be, this lever going, this is the work you need to worry about because there are growing problems with this. Then you can start to go and think about, is there any rational explanation why suddenly this ingredient has become more of a risk than it was 1 month ago, or 3 months ago, or 6 months ago? Then you can start to go, well, yeah, there are issues about production. There could be crop failures because of climate change. It might be that trading patterns have changed because of tariffs, for instance. And then you can start to really think about why these things are coming up on the risk dashboard as being high risk. then you can start to think about what supply chains of mine are involved in this particular commodity or ingredient. Then you can start to put your resources into, it might be testing, it might be audits, inspections, or in some cases, what businesses are doing now, they are completely changing their supply chains. And I see more and more of this. And again, Quincy, I'm not sure if this is something that you're experiencing, but some of the businesses, they're going, this part of the world, it's actually too big of a risk now. Where we have sourced from for many decades now, and now we're using AI again, Joris, where would be another good place in the world to source this from? Actually, they might not grow a lot of it now, but based on the geography, based on the climate, the soils, all sorts of, should we be thinking about? And then there is amazing opportunities actually for de-risking your business. Not only can you de-risk your business, but you can also start to think about things like what's the carbon footprint in this part of the world compared to growing it somewhere else. So there's lots of things, and this is very much, AI is one of the big tools that we are using in terms of what the future supply chains look like.
And Joris, what Chris is doing there is he's bringing in additional elements beyond fraud, right?
Yeah.
That really demonstrate the complexity of the food supply chain, right? Particularly once you start adding in some of the sustainability elements, upon which, particularly around claims, there's a tremendous amount of fraud as well, right? Mm-hmm. I really don't want to start scaring the listeners and really having them running for the hills, because it does get quite scary around the claims around sustainability too that are actually false. But it really demonstrates the complexity of our industry, the complexity of the work that we do, the need for expertise and real level expertise of people who know and understand the food industry to try to resolve these very, very complex challenges, right? That's why I would also say we need more investment in education. We need more university students coming through. We need that next generation of food experts like yourself, Joris, to really start coming through, right? And that is another area where I'm a little bit scared. I'm like, I don't know where they're coming from. We're seeing a reduction in numbers of people with food science degrees, right? And where's that next generation of leadership going to come from in order to keep the CFO and the CEO of these large businesses being able to give them some rest and sleep at night, because otherwise they're just going to be pulling out their hairs, right? It's quite a potential scary thing. I don't want them to stay up at night. I want them to get a good night rest so that the next day they can keep driving their food businesses forward. But it is a very complex industry and a very complex sector that we are in that is absolutely fundamental, because guess what? Everybody has to eat. Right? Ultimately, humans have to eat. Without food, we do not survive. So it is an absolutely fundamental industry. It is one that we're working very hard to protect as best as we possibly can. And that is where the EFF-CoP comes into play as well, right? A community of practice like the one that we already have, the Food Authenticity Network, right? Fundamental, because only together can we get out of this, right? We're never going to be able to do it on our own. We need to better understand our supply chains. We need to work with our suppliers. We need to work with external experts, academia like Chris, right? Young students like yourself who are coming through as well. We need to work with agronomists, with veterinarians, and bringing all of those experts together. That is how we can identify where are the problems around authenticity or inauthenticity, where are the problems around defense. Ultimately, under this umbrella, as Chris coined it a few years ago, food integrity. That's really what we're talking about here. Only together can we resolve this particular problem, which is why the EFF-CoP is an initiative that we have been supporting since the start. We will continue to support the Food Authenticity Network in the UK, which is a global network as well. We continue to support that. The Food Industry Intelligence Network, FIN, which Chris is also involved in, led by Sophie Lawrence, where we're also supporting that. All of these separate initiatives coming together are ultimately what we need in order to continue to protect ourselves as an industry as best as possible and protect the consumer ultimately, which is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, well said, thank you. Definitely, I think the collaboration and the community feel is something that really pushes ideas forward, sharing the knowledge, indeed from different points of view, bringing that together. That is something that pushes everyone's idea of what authenticity really is. So very, very interesting indeed. I want to go back to the view of the consumer. Then how does a consumer, how should they look at food right now? How can they be sure that their food is safe, that their food is authentic? And what might be the primary obstacle? What do we need for a consumer to make everything safe?
So one thing I will just correct there, Joris, if you don't mind, is that food authenticity is not necessarily a food safety issue, right? And that is important to point out. There are very large quantities of fraud that occur that have absolutely no food safety risk whatsoever. Nonetheless, and this is the key point that you're trying to make, Joris, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's all about trust, right? How can the consumer actually trust that what they are buying is what is actually in the product, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And unless a consumer is going to start getting a whole bunch of testing kits in their house for all the different kinds of products that they consume in their kitchen, that trust is absolutely fundamental. They need to trust the organizations, the companies that they buy their product from. That is the retailer that they go to. That is also the company who puts the food on the shelf at that particular retailer, and that the claim that they are making on their package is what is actually in there. That then comes back, and again, this is where we then go back down into the supply chain, right? The responsibilities all along that particular supply chain to drive that trust. I think that some of the technologies that Chris has spoken about, right, those are fundamental in helping us make sure that we can make sure that the product has and contains what it is that the company claims. There's another very large development as well, and that is around smart labels, right? There's an awful lot of information on food packaging these days, right? To the point where basically you could turn a food product into nothing more than an actual label that has a whole bunch of information that actually most consumers don't understand. Particularly through QR codes and even barcodes, but more importantly, some of the 2D QR codes now, there's a tremendous amount of information that sits behind that particular product that we can share with consumers in a way that we have never been able to do before. And that is very exciting. There's some great work being done in the US right now by the CBA, the Consumer Brands Association, around smart labels. Europe is looking at this as well, as are other countries around the world. And I think smart labels are going to be a key element in the long run to try and help drive some of that trust with the consumers, because it is directly linked to the information that the company themselves have. Is it going to solve all of it? No, but at least it's going to drive some more of that trust and bring some of that trust back to the consumer side of things, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you.
As much, Joris, as I really like these little portable technologies, handheld scanners, these should not be in the pocket or purse or handbag of consumers, okay? It is the responsibility of food businesses to guarantee the safety and the authenticity of food products that they sell. It is the responsibility of governments to guarantee the safety, the authenticity of food. If you get to the point where you're a consumer and you think you have to have some little device to test food, then we're in a really very difficult place, because that trust that Quincy talked about has been lost totally. And actually not even in food authenticity, but quite a number of years ago, I was contacted by a company. They were going to produce a scanner to detect food allergens, okay? And what they wanted to do was, they thought, well, there's millions of people in the world suffer from food allergies, and we're going to sell this little scanner to millions of people. And I just said, no, because that is the total loss of trust. If you think you have to scan every piece of food, and the second thing I said was, well, your scanner, is it 100% reliable and accurate? And they went, well, no, not 100%, but it's 95%, which means 1 time in 20 when you scan, you'll get the wrong result, okay? This is okay for laboratories, but not people who are taking decisions if you've got a peanut allergy. So trust is critical, absolutely critical. And a lot of those big brands that Quincy talked about, I support a lot of big brands. They understand that really well. They do not want loss of trust in their brand. And that's why they will put a lot of technical resource into managing their supply chains. There is a role for consumers, and that is, if you see something that is too good to be true, the food is too cheap, don't buy it, because then you're taking a risk. And you will not see that. I'm not talking about 30% off in a supermarket for something. I'm talking about you go to a market stall and you go, whoa, the department store around the corner, it's half the price of that. I will always go, there's a reason for that, okay? So consumers have to take some responsibility as well.
And I would add to that as well, Chris, report it, right? If you actually identify something, report it to your local food authority, right? I mean, that is where consumers can really help. That is one. The other thing is, I agree with Chris that the ultimate responsibility, and that is the final responsibility, sits with government, right? But ultimately, I'm a very big believer in public-private partnerships. It is about collaboration between the public sector, i.e. our food and health authorities, our policing system, so our crime units within government, the companies themselves, right? The testing labs, the auditors that go into food facilities. It is an absolute joint responsibility that ultimately, if there is a real problem, comes back and ultimately we sit with government. And then government needs to take action together through both themselves from a health authority perspective, as well as through its legal system. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Often, whenever there is a major food safety incident, particularly if it involves fraud, there will be, the industry will blame the government and the government will blame the industry. Always happens. And I do think what we have reached, particularly in the UK now, is a public-private partnership. We have got National Food Crime Unit, governmental. We have got FIN, the Food Industry Intelligence Network, which is industry. And the wonderful thing is they work so closely together. And we have kind of got past that blaming each other. It is taking joint responsibility.
And again, we see that beyond the fraud space as well, right? And in other parts of the world. I think it is very good to have government involved in industry dialogue, not intervening in it, but being able to sit in there, listen, understand, and hear the concerns of industry and the challenges that they are facing without necessarily intervening at that point. But it's really about mutual understanding, because if you work in silos and the public sector and the private sector work in complete and utter silos, then you're going to get that finger pointing and that blame going back and forth. And none of that really helps us address the actual problems that we have, right? It is really then about sitting together with ultimately recognizing government sets regulation. Government is responsible for enforcing that regulation. Yeah, it's government that tells the private sector what to do. It's not the private sector telling government what to do, which is why we as an organization, we do not lobby. We will sit down with government and we'll say, hey guys, we're seeing a problem over here. Are you seeing that as well? Is it something that we can have a discussion about? You guys need to intervene as a government, as a regulator. You need to intervene at the point where you feel that there is a need to intervene or where there is illegal activity actually occurring. So you tell us what to do, but you may want to listen to us because we're actually at the front of actually producing the actual food, right? So that is where the collaboration is absolutely fundamental. Get away from lobbying. Food industry should not be lobbying government. It should not be putting vast amount of money into political campaigns, in my opinion. I'm taking my SSAFE hat off, right? I'm just saying, for me, no, stop lobbying, but sit around the table, have a discussion, talk about what the big challenges are, try to create mutual understanding, and then go back, what is your responsibility as a food business? What is your responsibility as a government? And make sure that you address the particular challenges and issues that we have, ultimately to protect the consumer and drive trust back into the industry.
Yeah, I can only agree with that. Thank you very much, Quincy. I think then we're coming somewhat to a close here. So I would like to ask both of you to just quickly formate a little key takeaway, and maybe you could address. We've briefly addressed this, but what could a listener do to contribute to this authentic food system to drive the authentic food?
Okay, so it is based on our discussions. You'll probably pick up, Joris. It's very, very difficult for consumers to do that much. Now, when you make your purchasing decisions, think about, is it too good to be true? Because if it is, you're probably supporting some criminal activity, and you potentially are putting you and your family in some sort of danger, food safety danger. I think for consumers also, and particularly those people who actually work inside the food industry, they have so much knowledge. If you think something isn't right with the business that you're working for, or you see some strange behavior, like you live beside some warehouses and there's lorries coming at strange times at night, you tell the regulator, you tell the authorities. There are many different ways you can become what's called a whistleblower. You can do it in very, very safe spaces. And I know, because I work closely with the National Food Crime Unit in the UK, and they depend on that level of information intelligence from people who are just saying, something's not right here. There was big seizure in the UK just a few months ago, massive quantities of counterfeit rice coming into the UK. That was from a tip-off. Somebody saw something that wasn't just right. So if you see something that's not right, think of it as your responsibility. Inform those regulators, and you will find that they will act upon it.
Yeah, so Joris, from my perspective, if I focus a little bit more about what companies, whether large or small, can do, I'll just summarize what I said earlier, right? Make sure that you bring together as much information and data, also based on product testing. Deploy as many of the new emerging technologies, particularly the cheaper technologies that you can find within your organization. Identify vulnerabilities and mitigate against those vulnerabilities that you identify. Educate and train your staff around fraud as a whole and some specific mitigation techniques that you can deploy. Know your supply chain and trace back as much as you possibly can where your ingredients and your products are actually coming from. And then ultimately collaborate, right? Work with your competitors, work with your partners, be it your suppliers and your customers, work with government, because through collaboration, that is how we really strengthen food systems. We can reduce fraud and protect consumers. It's a joint responsibility, and I always say, together we are stronger. And that's the way I would say that we can actually really make this move forward and continue strengthening the food supply chain.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very strong takeaway. And indeed, with that, I would also like to invite the listener to get involved with EFF-CoP in whatever way you can or want to be involved. Be involved.
So thank you,
Joris.
Thank you, Joris. And as usual, I could sit and talk all day with Quincy about these things. It's a big topic, and well done for trying to bring it to the attention of more people. Great job.
All right, thanks.